Every time they file an indictment, we go way up in the polls. We need one more indictment to close out this election. One more indictment, and this election is closed out. Nobody has even a chance.
Interesting take by President Donald Trump. Defiant in his first speech since being arraigned on yet another round of federal criminal charges, predicting his legal issues are only going to help him in his bid to regain the White House. Let's talk about it with our Sunday group. Fox News Radio political analyst and Jewish Insider editor-in-chief Josh Krashar, constitutional lawyer Elizabeth Wydra, Doug High, former RNC communications director, and Horace Cooper, an author and legal commentator. Thank you all for being here today. All right, let's start there. The Wall Street Journal editorial board says this: the political point to keep in mind is that this is exactly where Democrats want voters to focus on Mr. Trump all day, every day. Horace.
Well, you know, when I was a kid, I was 5 years old, I think, and my grandmother told me the story about Br'er Rabbit. And it was the case where Br'er Rabbit was caught by the fox, finally. And he said to the fox, "You can drown me, you can eat me, you can roast me, but whatever you do, don't throw me into the briar patch." And the fox, being as vindictive as it could be, threw him into the briar patch and set him free. In a lot of ways, it looks like these indictments constitute the briar patch for our former president. And many of those, like the fox, think they finally caught him. They have him under control. It may prove to be just as much like the story of the Briar patch.
Yeah, that's what Axios is warning about over there. They say Trump is tied with Biden, despite most voters thinking that he committed serious crimes. They say Biden and Trump are tied in the polls, according to this New York Times Siena College poll, despite majority saying they think that Trump has committed serious federal crimes. Guess maybe just baked in with him. But there are warnings. We read about also, I think it was in Politico this week, that former President Obama had a lunch with President Biden and warned him about not taking President Trump seriously enough. I mean, Elizabeth, are Democrats going to be getting what they ask for at their own risk? I mean, because these polling results seem that they want President Trump, but he can actually put up a good fight with President Biden.
I think certainly, you know, we're seeing in that defiant speech that he is using these indictments to his political advantage with his base. But I think, you know, I think the administration was in some ways in a tough place, because if the facts lead to these indictments and these very serious issues of trying to overturn democracy and, you know, in the classified documents case, you know, potentially threatening the national security of the United States with these highly sensitive documents, you know, these are really serious charges. And so I think that the administration, you know, the Department of Justice, which is insulated from some of the political concerns, I think they did the right thing by following the facts and the law where it led. You know, whether or not a positive political thing, I think, is less clear, but in some ways I'm really proud of them for not engaging in those political calculus necessarily, and instead just working to really uphold the rule of law. And, you know, even if he can score points or fundraise off these indictments, you know, the Republican Party that I grew up with, you know, wanted to protect national security, wanted to ensure that people's votes were counted and that democracy reigned not only in the United States but around the world. So, you know, it seems like there's like cause for definite self-reflection for the party.
Well, and so also there's this interesting piece by David Brooks in the New York Times where he talks about, he says, what are for the bad guys here, people who are anti-Trump? Are they just pushing half of America into his arms? He says, it's easy to understand why people in less educated classes would conclude that they are under economic, political, cultural, and moral assault, and why they've rallied around Trump as their best warrior against the educated class. We can condemn the Trumpian populists until the cows come home, but the real question is, when will we stop behaving in ways that make Trumpism inevitable? A lot of people felt some condescension in that piece, but also thought it was an interesting kind of introspection. Like, the people who hate President Trump, are you making America love him?
Yeah, you don't see a lot of introspection in the media these days. And one thing that happens all the time on Capitol Hill, Republican meetings, Democratic meetings, Horace and I were in some of these meetings, somebody will say, let's challenge our own assumptions here. Like, what have we not thought through? What do we maybe have wrong that we can do better? And certainly that's part of what David Brooks is speaking to here, because what we see is there's a Trump, there's an anti-Trump, there's the anti-Trump, and it gets very convoluted very quickly. And when you're Democrats trying to plan out, okay, who do we want to face, you should be mindful that you played that game before. The Clinton campaign wanted to face Donald Trump. They got their ideal opponent, and we see what it got them. They lost in the end.
Well, and there's worry now, too, among Democrats. We've seen the polling that many within the party don't want President Biden to be their nominee again. That looks inevitable at this point. But there is also this worry in Politico. They say whistling past the graveyard, Democrats are worried. Their fears are growing over massive grassroots fundraising hit. They don't think that the Biden campaign is doing well on this front. It says the lack of grassroots engagement is a warning sign for Biden ahead of a tough election cycle, raising questions about whether the 80-year-old incumbent is exciting the Democratic base the way he will need to win in a second term.
Yeah, Shannon, we're about to head to an election where we could have a matchup between an indicted president and an 80-year-old president who has trouble making his case to the American public. And Joe Biden's fundraising numbers have been mediocre at best. He's raised less money at this point compared to Donald Trump in this quarter, running up to the re-election, compared to Barack Obama's run up to the re-election. Over half of Democrats in some polls show a desire for someone else to run as the Democratic nominee. And I think Joe Biden's biggest concern isn't so much Trump. And I mean, there's going to be a lot of voters looking at Trump's legal problems and voting for voting for Biden automatically. The challenge is getting them to show up, getting young voters to show up, getting the base to show up, and they're very, very apathetic right now about his campaign.
Yeah, that New York Times poll, with it tied at 43%, that wasn't about Donald Trump's strength. That was about a fundamental weakness of the incumbent. Joe Biden's in a very bad place politically.
Especially with black voters.
All right. We're going to talk more with the panel in just a minute.